4, 3, 2, 1.
Broadcasting live from the Newsmax studio in New York City. A fusion of politics, commentary, entertainment, and sports. Steve and his team bring you the latest news and opinion now. Here is Steve Malzberg.
All right, folks, it was late last week that the nation sat and watched and was horrified by what they heard in the courtroom down in Georgia. The father of the little boy who was roasted to death in a car after the father allegedly, by accident, forgot about him and left him in that car. Here's some of what took place in the courtroom that shed some light on just what might have happened.
Ross must have left him in the car, and they're like, what? There's no other reason. No other explanation, excuse me. Ross must have left him in the car. And they try to console her, and they're like, no, there's 1,000 reasons there. He could have taken him to lunch or something. We don't know yet. And she's like, no.
Did you uncover anything of what he was doing during that day while his child was out in the car?
Yes.
Okay. What did you uncover?
He was having up to 6 different conversations with different women. It appeared from the messages from Kik mostly, which is a messaging service.
And is that a computer-related messaging service?
It is.
And these conversations he was having with these females, were these, of what nature were they?
The most common term would be sexting.
Okay, that's just some of what was taking place in the courtroom last week. And by the way, in the beginning they were talking about the wife, and we'll get to the wife in a second. But joining us now, as mentioned, is Dr. Mary Ellen O'Toole, retired senior profiler for the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit for 28 years. And Doctor, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
It's great to talk to you. All right. Before this court hearing, which resulted in the judge's decision that there would be a trial and that bail was denied, I heard some anchors on CNN, one saying, hey, I left my kid, actually a legal analyst saying, I left my kid in a car once for 5 minutes and I've never lived it down, so let's give this guy a pass. And I heard another anchor say, there but for the grace of God goes I, hasn't he suffered enough? And then all this came out. What did you see? What kind of person, as a profiler, did you see in that courtroom when you heard all this, and I guess in combination to hearing the facts from the police anyway, you also looked at him, a man who sat basically expressionless for most of the time. He did cry a little bit. What was your take?
Well, there's a lot of stuff going on. So first, when you have a case like this, you cannot personalize the crime. So as a trained profiler, you learn, you don't say, well, I did that in a way that I felt was this way, or I wouldn't have done it that way, or that I left my own kids in the car. You never personalize it because this isn't your crime scene. It's his crime scene. That's number one. Number two, when you work in the BAU, quite frankly, we see moms and dads, biological parents, kill their children pretty frequently in horrible ways. And so when I first heard that, and the fact that it was 7 hours that went by, unless this person had some type of really extreme memory issue, maybe medicated or something, this didn't sound like an accident. Way too long for that to happen. Now you jump into the courtroom, and then you've got someone that's sitting there fairly stoically, but we have to keep in mind that his attorneys probably told him, you're going to hear awful things, you need to sit there and just not have, you can't have a strong emotion a strong reaction because the judge is going to say something to you if you do. But all that said, when you evaluate behavior, what you have to do is say, I want to know how this person's behavior was like 5 or 6 months ago, 10 years ago. Then I can tell you right now if this is odd, out of the ordinary, or maybe it's very consistent with this person being very closed, very cold-blooded, very selfish, very narcissistic, and very unattached to his child. But before I can say that, I can't just look at that behavior on one day and make that assumption. I have to know something about what he was like, what Ross was like before this crime ever happened. And that's the difference between someone who studies behavior and someone who simply opines on it.
Right, like me. The latter is me. But when you heard, so to tell me whatever you can based on the little that you heard, because you didn't hear how he was 10 years ago, and you say you need that. But when you heard that he sexted with 6 different women while the kid was in the car, that he went to the car several times while the child was in the car, and at some point probably dead, and that he, had just eaten lunch with the child. I mean, and does that and looked online how to live a life without children, or a childless life, and looked online also about animals dying in hot cars and children dying in hot cars. I mean, it goes on and on, taking out insurance policies and then immediately asking relatives how to go about cashing it in once his son was dead. I mean, this must tell you something.
This told me that this was likely very intentional. All of those things that you mentioned, that this was very likely not an accident. You just take a few of the things. When you're sitting and you're texting for a period of 7 hours, it's not the shock of, oh my gosh, you're sexting to someone. What that says to me is that you're able to function. Strategically, you're able to put together emails and photographs and send them to 6 different people. So neurologically, you're working. Your brain is working, which tells me there's probably not a memory loss that took place during that day. So that's one thing that told me. His friends also testified that they went to lunch, and there was nothing unusual about his behavior. In other words, he wasn't sweating, he wasn't crying, he wasn't distracted. According to the testimony, he seemed to be the typical Ross. So, again, that told me that he didn't have the appearance of a lot of stress or a lot of anxiety. He goes back to the car, and by that time, and throws the light bulbs in the car, and he throws them in, and he notices nothing. And I think the medical testimony is going to say by that time there would have been something in there. If he had no idea what had happened, there had been something that would have either triggered his thought memory or something that would have begun, his little boy would have begun to have an strongly told me that this is probably not an accident. Probably not an accident.
All right, now let me ask you, and we know even much, much less about the wife. But the wife, from the testimony we've heard, 2 things we do know. Well, 3 from the court appearance, too. She sat pretty much expressionless during the whole proceeding. And make it 4. At the funeral, not only did she defend her husband, but this was news to me yesterday. She reportedly said that if she could bring her son back, she wouldn't. Also, in the jail, or where her husband was being held, when she went there to see him for the first time after learning that her son was dead, instead of crying and saying, what happened, she said, did you tell them too much? And when she went to pick up her kid prior to that at the school, and they said, oh, he's not here, the first thing she said, according to witnesses, was, oh, he must have left, my husband must have left him in the car. And they said, no, there's a million explanations. And she said, no, he must have left him in the car. Now, I don't even know. I don't even know what to make of this. You tell me, on that limited amount of information from those different different scenes that she was speaking at, what you could gain from that.
A lot, actually, and what we typically do, we never look at one comment, like we don't look at one piece of behavior. We look at what we call the totality of the circumstances. So the totality of all this, the statements and the behavior made by the wife are suspicious. I know I've heard people say, well, you can't really say how people mourn. That's ridiculous. That's what people say when they're not trained in behavior.
What you just said is true sometimes, but in this case, it's ridiculous, in my opinion, to say that. But go ahead.
It is, and because there's a point like the bell curve, like our grades in college, where here's normal in the middle, and then you had the extreme on any ends. But there is behavior that crosses a line where it just becomes very odd, very strange, very inappropriate. And as an investigator, you can't let that go. You have to pursue that and find out, is this person typically odd or strange, or is that so out of the ordinary that now they're suspicious? I never get hung up on how people behave in court, because they could be told to keep their cool, just sit there and don't have a lot of emotion. So that can be somewhat, that's more coached behavior. Right. So we have to put that aside. But the other behavior, particularly that behavior at the funeral, that was so flamboyant. That was so full of, let's look at mom, let's look at us. We're the parents. Let's talk to the church through a speakerphone. That's the one I said, look, find out if these people are attention seekers, because if they are, maybe they've done something like that in the past in a lesser extreme circumstance. But when you look at all those things added up, they do add up to behavior that has to be investigated. And there's a point at which it becomes suspicious. In my opinion, her behavior, her comments are suspicious.
Yeah, and her also going online and looking at children suffocating to death in a car. So even though you don't know at this point, going back, 10 years and what they've done in the past, and as you know, as a profiler for the FBI, that does play into to everything. So I'm asking you to step out of that role just a little bit. Mm-hmm. But what you did, from what you see here, mm-hmm. Is the wife in trouble too?
I would believe that the wife is going to have some problems down the road. I do, and it may be a strategy thing right now where
but get her to rat on the husband, right?
Well, it could be. I mean, they're a good office down there. They have a lot of experience, so it could be a circumstance of charge one parent and not the other. But with everything that you've laid out and everything that I know about the case, this thing is not over in terms of the wife and her involvement and how they may want to use her in this case, and how much more that they need to know about her. So we have not seen the end of this concerning the wife.
Well, Doctor, I hope you'll come back as this all progresses. Very insightful, and thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Dr. Mary Ellen O'Toole worked for the FBI for 28 years in the Behavioral Analysis Unit. Every time I see that picture of the father with that little boy, that beautiful little boy, what do you say? What could anybody say? All right, folks, when we come back, we will be joined by the senior contributor for the Daily Caller, Matt Lewis, coming up next, right here on the Steve Malzberg Show.